Good morning, everybody. Pity it isn't sun isn't out, but it'll come later. One thing I'd like to say is it's a great pleasure to see such an enormous crowd of people around here and an enormous number of vehicles. It's a long, long time ago since I've seen this number of vehicles of the minor category all together. And I must say, I greatly appreciate it all. And I must say that if my old boss, Alec Isagonis, was alive, he'd love to be here now. It'd be really a treat to him. But alas, he's gone a long time ago, and I'm left as the oldest one of the system to it. I was actually his number one design and development engineer. As that, of course, we were working on the miner now, not 50 years ago, but some 55 odd years ago when we first started. Actually, just before the war, we were nibbling at it very quietly, and towards the end of the war, we were nibbling at it rather more so. So, rather more time than 50 years as far as I'm concerned.
To look at the development of the Morris Minor, we have to go back to the pre-war years when Alec Isagonis was working on unitary construction cars. And what was really a brave move, the management at Morris Motors set Alec Isagonis up along with Jack Daniels and later at Reg Job to start the development work on a new car for the post-war years.
Tell us a little bit about what it was like to work with Izzy, as you called him.
Well, it was different. There's no doubt he was a personality in his own right, and he had very clear pictures of what he wanted to do. I mean, amongst other things, he always wanted to get the maximum payload space in any given car. That's the theme he was working on throughout his lifetime, and the way he did it, he's inspired. That's all I can say about it.
The project was actually based on a prototype car called the Mosquito. This was a very much a revolutionary car, used monoconstruction methods, and Isagonis was keen that it should have all the sort of current thinking embodied in the car. So he set to with independent front suspension, small wheels, a narrow-bodied car, and right from the outset it resembled very much what became the Morris Minor.
Mr. Avioke, who was the technical director of the whole of the Morris organisation at that time, he obviously recognised that what Isagonis was capable of, and he also recognised that he had to put somebody behind him with a more practical experience. And as I had been working with the Wolseley factory from where Avioke came, I'd been working with him quite a lot on MG work beforehand. He picked me to join Isagonis, which I did, and somehow or other we just gelled together.
It featured many revolutionary ideas, not least of which was the idea for a flat-4 engine. This unfortunately was fated and never actually reached production, and in an effort to save money, Morris Motors actually finally installed a 918cc side valve engine into the Morris Minor. The reason for this was that it was an easy thing to do. The 918 engine had been installed in the Morris 8 Series E, which preceded the Morris Minor as a small car of the time. And so it eventually came to the very late in development that there were some changes in the shape of the car. Isagonis at times I think feared that the car might not actually see production because there were so many boardroom wrangles about it. Lord Nuffield, of course, disliked the car immensely, and in what's a well-documented episode, he actually referred to the prototype as a poached egg. It didn't go down well with Isagonis, as you can imagine. But he did actually describe the car as being narrow-gutted, which is a strange expression nowadays, but it actually prompted Isagonis into some last-minute changes, which actually changed the shape of the car forever. This actually involved cutting one of the prototypes in half and then moving the two parts apart, and at precisely 4 inches Isagonis thought that the proportions were absolutely right. And a legacy of this is the fact that on the Morris Minor you actually have a 4-inch insert in the bonnet here, which is the job was given to Reg Job to accommodate these extra 4 inches. And the way in which he did it was to add 4 inches to the middle and to the roof on the saloons and obviously to the boot. And then at the side of the car, he actually, to save having to disturb the transmission tunnel, he actually inserted 2 inches either side on the outer limits of the floor. Now, one of the unusual things about the car is that when this 4 inches actually was added, we actually had an insert put in the front and the rear and the bumpers. And it's said that the car was so close to production at that time that the bumpers were already made. And again, as a cost-saving exercise, what they did was they cut them in half, put a 4-inch fillet in between. And with that, the Morris Minor was virtually ready for production. And of course, it made its debut at the 1948 Motor Show.
In the days when we were starting this, an 8-year life cycle of a car was about the standard. And we were going to do much better than that, and we went for 10 years as our thoughts of what we do. But 50 years, no one in their right minds would have thought of that.
Ray, when I first looked through your book, I remember seeing these early sketches by Alec Issigonis. How closely do they resemble the final product?
Well, it's amazing, really, when looking at these again. It's always been said it's uncanny, the resemblance to the early sketches to the final product. And when you look at this, you can see that apart from the front-end styling, it's virtually all there. It's all Morris Minor right from the outset. And I think this tells us that he had a dogged determination to make sure that his ideas got through right to the end. In fact, this sketch here reminds me of a comment that was made that he actually designed the car right the way down to the button on the glove box locker.
It's incredible.
Now, the front-end styling did give him some problems. It's said that there was some American influence from the Packard Clipper of the time, and certainly the split screen was there right from the outset.
Right.
There are some changes in relation to the grille, in the fact that the very early cars, the headlamps were actually concealed behind the grille. Of course, in the final production model, we find that they are nicely proportioned either side of a chrome-plated grille, which really set the car off. And of course, with the extra 4 inches, the proportions, as we said before, were absolutely right.
I'd imagine then these sketches must be quite valuable now.
Indeed they are. In fact, some of these sketches came into private ownership only in 1996. And one of our club members, Keith Fletcher, actually paid £26,000 for 6 sketches. So I don't know what Issigonis would think of it now, but certainly they're in the hands of a true enthusiast, and they're there for posterity.
So Ray, how was the Minor first received when it was unveiled at the 48 Motor Show?
It was the star of the show, undoubtedly. People flocked in their thousands to see the car, and all the engineers of the day acclaimed it as being a masterpiece of engineering.
Right.
It was new in the fact that it was a new small car. The emphasis previous to that had always been on larger vehicles. But Issigonis had got it right. The only downside of it was you couldn't get one if you lived in Britain, because they were only available really for export.
Yeah.
And the car we're in now, of course, is all the more rare for that, because a 1949 Tourer, very difficult to get hold of. There were all sorts of restrictions on getting cars at that time, and second-hand cars became something of a premium. In fact, within a couple of years, you could pay almost twice what the original asking price was for the Minor if you wanted to get a second-hand Minor. 90% went abroad for export.
Well, I went for my interview to become an apprentice with the then Morris Motors Company in September 1951, and I was fortunate enough to be offered the post. And I always remember the date that I joined, because it was September the 3rd, and I always wondered whether it would be the start of another world war, because the date coincided. The thing which is the first impression of being there is the vast number of people that every morning used to pour in through the various gates at 7:15. 7:15 was critical because the blower, as it was known locally, was the thing which summoned everybody to Nuffields Works, as it was called at the time. So the pace of people going through the gate increased considerably as the time approached to 7:15. If you got through to 7:20, you didn't lose any money, but after 7:20 you lost a quarter of an hour automatically. So you could either sit down and do nothing till 7:30, or you got on with your work, and certainly as apprentices we got on with our work.
See, the bodies came down from Birmingham on the forerunner of the current car transporter. You get, I think it was, if I remember rightly, 6 bodies on a trailer. And they'd come into FH block, as it later became known, and they'd be degreased, checked for damage, or that would all be rectified. Then they'd be put through the rotodip process, which would put, I'm not sure exactly, but between 5 and 6 coats of a base primer. They'd come out brown, I remember, because at one time I used to inspect them in 1950 something. Then they go through this rotodip process. I said they'd go in several tanks, put on a chain with a spit through each body, and the body would be turning as it went down the line. It would go into each vat and turn inside the liquid. So, as I said, all of the nooks and crannies within all the channels have got a proper coating to anti-rust protect it.
I went into the experimental department in 1950, and I remained there until 1955, and worked on various models of the range at the time, but particularly I did a lot of work on the Morris Minor.
Now they were looking to produce an improved engine, so drop the side valve engine. So you were involved in 1952 on this 10,000 mile run, weren't you? Tell us more about that.
Yes, the 10,000 mile run was the objective was to prove that a car would do much higher mileage without servicing, because service intervals were being increased. The run took place at Goodwood, and a special tender was built which enabled the car to be serviced on the move with the wheels still rolling and still being driven under its own power. That took place in October 1952, and it used the A-Series 803 engine, and the car averaged 50 miles an hour and very nearly 50 miles to the gallon throughout the whole run.
That was some achievement, I would have thought, Peter, for the time.
It was a long way ahead of the competition in those days, yes, it was.
Billy Morris had been over to America and before the war, and picked up he was the original mass production man, wasn't he, in this country? Picked up a lot of the ideas, and he was the man who brought in the production line. These are things we're just talking about, and niceties, like make things easier, make it quicker to do. It still goes on, you know, efficiency never stops. Well, to start off the process in the trim shop, you'd have leather hides, or the Rexine, and that'd be cut to the shapes required. Then it would go to the ladies in the sewing area, banks of sewing machines, you know, dozens and dozens, and they'd sew the required covers for the seats or parts of the body inside fillets. Then some of it would go to the glue room where the ladies would glue bits together. Eventually that would all finish up with the seat assemblers, who then put these covers onto the metal frames of the seats, and out at the other end would come the seats for the cars. Put that on a conveyor, send it to the assembly building in sequence, so that you got the right colour or the right size of seat for the right car as it came up the production track.
So I started in the apprentice school, and that was basically 2 years in there, running through all the machining processes. And after the first year we were allowed out into the various shops, usually for a period of a month. And that was my first involvement with the experimental department, where the Morris Minor was developed, and I expressed an interest in returning there towards the end of my apprenticeship if I could. We were given the option in the last year of picking a department to be in, and so having passed all the way through the various production shops in the course of the apprenticeship, I went into the experimental for a period of 6 months and anticipated that I would be staying there at the end of my apprenticeship. And unfortunately, fate intervened in the shape of the choice list. We were given by the apprentice supervisor a document with 9 choices on it, and you had to write in the department that you would most like to be in, and the 9th was one you would least like to be in. Well, in common with all of my colleagues in the apprentice department, we automatically wrote the drawing office into number 9 position, and I put the experimental as number 1, and then various departments like planning, rate fixing, stores were put down there, and in line with a lot of my colleagues, number 9 was the choice that was picked for me. So I found myself as a detailed draftsman in the chassis drawing office.
And we assembled the car totally in Cowley, and then including the engine, the wheels and everything. And what you're looking at there is that is about a minute before the car is then started up for the very first time, start the engine. Then you'd run it off the track and put it onto the rolling road, as it was known in those days, probably still is. That's a roller test situation. We've got huge rollers in a booth. The car would be driven on to the rollers and then run through the process of up through the gears into top gear, back down, test the brakes without the car moving, the static road test. Of course, a number of cars would then be taken on the road, and a proper road test would take place, but that at 35 an hour, which was the production rate, you couldn't really drive 35 cars an hour around Oxford and Cowley to test them. So we invented this this static testing, which is all the rage everywhere nowadays.
The result really revolutionised the. It brought the miner into another era, really, because the engine produced more power, the service intervals were reduced, and generally it uprated the car.
Well, when you get down to basic techniques of mass production, if you can make everything the same, and the more you can make the same, the quicker and slicker you can make them. But obviously customers have got their own requirements. 35 an hour or something like that on the Morris Minor in the 50s for certain. There were 4 lines in that building at that time. One of the lines was the mix line, as we call it, not one everybody. It's not a situation you would encourage, but because of the production rates, and you have to maximise your facilities anyway, then you would have mixed lines, and I think there were Morrises, Rileys, Wolsleys. At one time we did a Vanden Plough, but that was the bigger production car, so that the average rate would be a lot lower per week, you know, somewhere in the 500-600 a week, as opposed to the 1,500, 2,000 Morris Miners.
And you could always tell because the lads' toolboxes were massive when they were on
I remember one guy, Ginger, I think his name was. And we'd have a toolbox would be something like, let's say, 9 inches by 18 into compartments, and that guy used to take with his nuts, his bolts, his screws in. This guy on the mix line screwed 4 of those together, so when he picked it up, it was about a square metre, all the little compartments, so that he didn't have to go back to his bench for any bits. But I think he had a very strong right arm at the time, I think. Yeah.
Unfortunately, when we came to 1962, there had been a decision to amalgamate all the drawing office and experimental activities in the Birmingham area, and it was in fact called the Amalgamated Drawing Office, and the drawings for a long time carried the code word ADO. So in '62 I had to look for something different to do, and what proved to be an opportunity was that the current method of looking after the quality of vehicles at the time was essentially an inspect and reject. So effectively the production people built the vehicle, there were stages when they were inspected, a card was written up with the defects on, the snaggers and rectifiers rectified the problem, and the cycle continued on. The problem that the factory faced was that vehicles which reached the end of the system still not rectified were lost to output. And so under the then chief inspector, who was Reggie Blois, he persuaded the management that it would be a good idea to employ 6 of us to set up a quality control department to prevent the problems rather than try to just cure them. And that led to very interesting developments. We brought in something which now is commonplace, wing covers, because an awful lot of scratch work was going on. We instituted the buckle patrol, which was to find out if people were wearing belts with buckles which did the scratch work on. Pump screwdrivers were very lethal, and so we tried to outlaw those because they slipped. and in fact far more use was made of the windy tools, and the noise in the production shop was quite horrific when the production was going with the whistles coming from those.
Well, one of the jobs, as the car came out of the paint shop, it went down the what we call the feed line. This was a very fast line. You just put the car on to get to the beginning of the production process. That would run at about 70 cars an hour. And that's pretty fast. You know, it's moving at something like 15, 20 feet a minute. But one of the jobs on that track was to put this coach line along the side mouldings, and one name in particular, there were several blokes did it, but Teddy Oldstop, a well-known Oxford character, who's no longer with us. I used to watch him fascinated. He would stand at the side of the car, and the car was going almost fast enough for him not to move, and just put his brush on this moulding, and this magical coach line would appear off this special-made brush to do the job, with a very long brush part of it. The hairs were about 2.5 inches long. But it almost fascinating to see a guy do what nowadays is done by sort of plastic film, but he'd just stand there and perfect every time. Well, one of the things before I left Cowley, we were talking about letting customers come back and to attract customers and get a feeling of belonging, to get customers back to see the process and that sort of thing. I mean, they can visit the factory. And it struck me as being quite odd that years ago we used to do that. When I first came to Cowley, the customer could come along, see his car finished of the production process, and drive it away. And it gave him an opportunity to point out one or two things if he needed to have them done at the time. And of course, in those days, the cars were driven by delivery drivers. You see hordes of guys with these red and white plates around the country, because in those days they hadn't invented the car transporter, which we see so much of these days. Because I remember we were always getting letters from little old ladies saying, I saw somebody driving a Morris Minor at 35 miles an hour, because in those days you ran a car in at 30 miles an hour for the first 500 miles. And anybody within 100 miles of Cowley who drove one too fast, somebody saw him and wrote to us and tell us. It's quite funny at the time.
And there was the Morris Motors band, wasn't there?
Well, that's how I started in the factory. When I left the army after my national service in 1953, I had an audition with Harry Mortimer and came down to Cowley because he could find you a job in the factory when you played in the band. And it was a fine band, one of the best in the country. And there was a total social side. In fact, you know, we hear so much about strikes and things like that these days, but I remember we'd sing Christmas carols in the week before Christmas on the production lines when I worked there. Somebody'd suddenly strike up a chorus and somebody'd be singing Christmas carols all morning, that sort of thing. Going back to the band used to play once a week in the canteen, on a Thursday from 12 to 1 for a concert for the lads. That gave me an hour off work, which didn't go down too well with the lad who had to do my job at the time. We used to play at Sports Day. Now that was a big event at Cowley. You'd get 1,000 people on the social club sports ground to watch the Sports Day. Everybody would enter. The football, the interdepartmental football, I played in that a couple of times, and I remember the cup final day, I was in wiring and erecting on that side of the business. And that was like an FA Cup final day in the factory. And 1,000 to 1,500 people come and watch the interdepartmental cup final at Cowley.
How many teams would enter that, Rob?
20, I suppose. Trim shop, A and B, wiring and erecting, mounting shop, paint shop, A and B, carpentry. Good teams, because lots of the players, I mean, every factory would have players from every standard. We had ex-professionals in the factory, a lot of the senior league players from around Oxford City. Because the other thing about working on the track, if you wanted anything done, you know, you only had to ask. Because with so many people working in a place, if you wanted some plumbing done or some painting at home, or a car needed mending, or the horse wanted shoeing, you ask around to the fact there'd be somebody on that production track who could do anything.
Was there a barber there, Ron? I say that because when I was working at Aerospace Filton, there was a barber actually.
1 and 3pence. You could book your appointment, and Paddy would come cut your hair, and I had my hair cut there for years. He died about 18 months ago. And he cut hair up till he was about 85 in Cowley. But he had his own little barber shop in the factory. And he'd be released from the rack to go and have it. He had a dentist. We had our own dentist on the plan. Good hospital, always had good hospitals and doctors. That side of things was very important. But never big serious accidents, if I remember rightly. 1 or 2 over the many years, but no, for a factory that size, pretty good. But that side, medical and dental and welfare work was very much an important part of what goes on.
And just going back to the band, you actually broadcast every 3 months, did you say, Ron?
We would broadcast
London?
every month, bright and early. It was programmed at bright and early at 6:30 in the morning. We would go down on a Wednesday night, do the recordings up in Maida Vale, in the Morris Motors band coach, which was well known all through the country. Particular coach, sort of half double-decker at the back it was.
Oh yeah, on a
Morris,
split level type, yeah?
Yeah, on a Morris commercial chassis, that's right, yeah. And we'd go up there once a month, I think. Because Harry Mortimer, the conductor, was the BBC director of music for brass and military bands. I'm sure that helped a bit.
In its early years, the Morris Minor was produced almost exclusively for the exports market. As government legislation had made it impractical and expensive to export complete vehicles, the CKD system, meaning completely knocked down, became increasingly important to the Nuffield organisation. Vehicles were shipped abroad in components form and subsequently assembled in their country of destination. This export or die mentality resulted in a major expansion of the original small-scale operation at Cowley, and it led to the eventual move to a purpose-built factory with over 100,000 square feet of floor space. CKD made terrific economic sense. British vehicles could be assembled abroad while incurring lower tariffs than those attached to fully built imported vehicles. There were also benefits for the importer, who was able to modify the Morris Minor to meet local market requirements. The first CKD miners dispatched for export all went to Ireland, a process which started in 1948. A very positive legacy of CKD is the continued popularity of the minor in countries which benefited from this remarkable operation.
Yeah, it was decided 4 weeks ago we'd do a car especially for the Jubilee celebration. So gold, it had to be gold, and gold is quite controversial on a Morris Minor. It's not an original colour, but you will agree the result turned out quite well. It is actually a Jaguar colour, so it's keeping an English type of colour together.
The Blenheim Golden Jubilee certainly wouldn't have been the same without the Irish contingent.
Thank you, Dad. He's a lovely man. Mum was asking, would you be dropping home?
But Australia became the miners' largest overseas market, And after many of the early models were imported as complete vehicles, CKD established a strong foothold near Sydney Racecourse. The Molenaar Company led the way in Holland. CKD miners continued to be assembled there until 1966, using a wide variety of locally sourced components. The Molenaar's operation was vast. It was supported by an extensive dealer network with no fewer than 52 outlets, and it supplied vehicles to Belgium and Luxembourg, as well as throughout Holland.
And is there still strong interest in the miner in your country?
Yeah, and we have to keep them on the road. There are nearly 800 in Holland. Yeah.
And why is the Morris Minor so special to you?
It's my hobby, and I'm making a living out of it.
Are you?
But I do both.
In what way?
I'm selling parts. This is I'm sponsoring this rally from Holland,
right.
And I'm selling the parts from them, and also the cars. But the cars are a bit expensive at this moment because of your rate of the pound.
Oh, I see. Yes, of course.
So
yeah.
at this moment I am only doing the spares of them.
This was my first love for Morris Minor. We bought it 12 years ago as a pile of junk. My husband restored it himself in about a year. And you see what it's about now. And it's a special car because it's especially built for Holland and assembled in Holland. And
right.
There are not so many cars in Holland who are specially made for Holland. So that's why it's an original number plate.
Right.
And it's a lovely car.
CKD also thrived in Denmark, South Africa, Indonesia, the Philippines and New Zealand, where the last miner was manufactured at the Dominion Motor Plant in 1974. By this time, 1.6 million units had been made worldwide.
This was our main emphasis to come over here to be for the 50th Jubilee of our little car that brings us all together. And firstly, I'd like to thank the organisers for this, to organise an event that we can all get together with a common factor being the Morris Minor. I think it's great.
Peter bought one after he left school. We couldn't find the original, so we bought a second-hand one and had it restored to its original condition. Sort of a nostalgia thing, really. Yes.
Peter, do you see many miners still in New Zealand?
Yes, there's a lot of Morris Minor. The movement is getting a lot of momentum up, and the fact is it's dearer to buy them now. They're starting to appreciate, not depreciate.
Whatever the language of the copywriters, the Morris Minor's hallmark was quality first. In 1955, as exports of fully built Morris Minors approached an all-time high, Sir Leonard Lord, chairman of the British Motor Corporation, made a proud announcement. Exports for that year had totalled nearly 200,000, which exceeded every other motor manufacturer in the world. Such was the volume of trade that ships were chartered specifically to meet demand. In some territories, such as on the African continent, the road infrastructure was so poor that vehicles had to be air freighted to the point of distribution. By 1960, the Morris Minor had become the first British car to achieve 1 million sales.
So the company then decided that they really ought to do a special edition, which of course was before special editions were common, to celebrate production of the millionth Minor. And the first car is this one, which was taken off the production line to be a prototype. That was done during November 1960. And then when they'd actually made the millionth car, they made a special limited edition of 350, all in this colour, to celebrate.
Now, what other special features does this car have apart from the colour scheme, Andrew?
Well, the interior is different. It's white leather seats with black carpeting and black piping around the seats. There are special chrome wheel trims on the wheels, and the badges on the car say Minor Million rather than Minor 1000. So mechanically it's a very standard car. To look at, it looks very different.
And what were the exact numbers again, Andrew, that were produced to this model?
They made 350 of them, including the millionth car itself. The millionth car itself isn't here today. It's actually being restored at the moment, but it does still exist.
I see. So really, what we're saying is there's a fair percentage of these cars left on the road today, by the look of it.
Well, I look after the Minor Million register, and we've traced about 70 cars. Not all of them are on the road, but 70 still in existence.
That is a high percentage, really, isn't it?
1 in 5 is a pretty high percentage of a colour which I think in 1961 most people thought was disgusting.
The vehicle, which had been promoted by Nuffield's copywriters as the world's supreme small car, was indeed conquering the globe, and its popularity remains indestructible.
So why the Minor, why not the Volkswagen Beetle?
Oh, it's the face of the Minor is a little bit more lovely, so maybe.
And actually I think the Morris Minor is better to handle with, because all the valves and everything in the Beetle, they are somewhere you can't get your hands in and you get your fingers broken.
Right,
and so it is much
easier to maintain, work on, yeah.
On the Minor itself, the coal board operated hundreds of Morris Minors, and we frequently made visits to the major customers to see how the vehicles were performing. The only problem that the reps with the coal board had was the water in the boot, which in fact was a problem on the saloon, which really wasn't cured until the end of production, because you had a very long lid and not much pulling down power. And I recall in visiting a dusty coal mine down in South Wales, and met with, I think, about 8 of these. Why they chose white Morris Minors in a coal field, I don't know, but they had these white cars, and they all came up and said, these cars go forever, but can you do something about this, please? And we opened the boot, and in each corner was a little soft sponge and pad. They said we have to squeeze that out every morning to get rid of the wet. So we did in fact finish up with a newly developed seal, which largely addressed the situation. And I recall we had some discussions with the Bristol police, because I believe it was the Bristol police were one of the very early police forces to have the concept of panda cars, and they had the Morris Minor as a panda car. And I remember a rather burly policeman coming to see us with his Morris Minor and showing us where the seat had broken away with his weight. The exhaust pipe had fractured at the front end due to the non-stop usage, and the doors were cracking. But we were very pleased for him to say to us, don't worry about those things, because in comparison with all the competition, this will run forever.
Maureen, a lovely example here of a police Minor, finished in Bermuda blue. How long have you actually owned the car?
We've only actually owned the car for the past 2.5 years. We acquired it from a friend of my husband's who gave up on it as a project that he started. It came to us as a jigsaw puzzle, and my husband pieced it all back together, and it's been on the road since March last year.
Now, something your husband was saying earlier, Maureen, interesting, is the fact that this car does 30 miles a day on the M25.
That's right. My husband goes from Grays to Romford, 15 miles each way, to work and back each day.
And how does he find the performance on the M25? Because with the hustle and bustle of the London traffic.
He doesn't mind it too much. It's quite hectic, but this car's pretty good. It keeps up most of the time. There's the odd day it doesn't go out, i.e. when it's really torrential rain or snow, then he'll take one of the other cars, because obviously vision is a bit limited sometimes with these.
Now tell us about the legal aspects then, Maureen, of having the police signage on them. It's not the done thing, is it, once you get out the bounds of today's show?
No, we're not allowed to go on the road with the signage. It's been said that you can pay up to £1,000 in fines for impersonating a police officer. It's not something I can afford to do, so obviously the magnetic signs come off as soon as we hit the roads.
Kevin, you've come down in your Morris 1000 from the West Midlands. Now, you've some history on your car, haven't you? Can you explain to us a little bit about your vehicle?
Yeah, basically we found out that this was an ex-police car when we had it painted up as an ordinary white Morris Minor. We traced a bit of the history to find out that it came from the Devon and Exeter police force, and it came from the Torquay area, so we've restored it back in its original condition as close as we can, using photographs and other information to put it back as close as possible.
The Miner enjoyed a very distinguished career in the British police force in the late 1960s and early 1970s, but the largest fleet user was the post office. Over 52,000 miners were used by the post office from the early 50s to the early 70s. The Morris 1000 Traveller was used extensively throughout the armed forces between 1966 and 1971, and, more familiar to the public, thousands of learner drivers had their first experience on the road in a Morris Minor. And once they passed their test, RAC men in Morris Minors were on call to provide salvation.
Well, to complete our piece on working miners, Paul informs me that this machine has a low compression engine, which gives it more torque at low revs and a higher top speed. Let's see what happens. Many Morris Minor owners consider restoration during their ownership, and Tim Lang now offers the opportunity with his business to come up with examples like this. This is a concourse car, completely original specification, and a 68 Traveller, and it really is well worth a look at. Well, call me old-fashioned if you like, but this is the type of example of car that I really love. Completely restored, everything virtually original specification. This is a concourse car, owned in fact by Tim Lang. The interior, this is supplied by Newton Commercials. They'll actually supply the padding, the webbing, the foam inserts, carpeting, just to produce your car to this specification.
I started at school, Courtfield School in Wellington, Somerset. We had a Morris Minor in class, and it was because of working on that I fell in love with the shape and just the general design of the car.
And then you of course purchased a Traveller?
Yes, I did. Yes, I purchased that when I was 16. I'd done a little bit of woodwork restoring that and resprayed the wings with aerosols, you know, the usual type of things you do. And then eventually I've taken it, stripped it all apart about 3 years later, and done it to the concourse standard you saw earlier.
Here we are down in Tim's workshop. He's kindly manoeuvred the car onto a jig so that we can take a good look at the underside. Just look at the mess that this car's found in on one side. It's 44 years old, remember, so you can be sure that some poor repair work would have been carried out in that time. You can see that the sills are covered by other repair plates, trapping moisture and then enhancing the rust process. There you can clearly see the two plates pulling apart from each other. Rot setting in severely. And then we go on to the rear spring hanger. Now, in extreme circumstances, this can actually detach from the underside of the car, and most of the time you find that poor repair work's been carried out just to get it through another 12 months MOT. Now you can consider that if of course this hanger does detach from the underside of the car, you've got no rear end stability, so like I said, in extreme cases that leaf spring could be just flapping about, pivoted on the other rear spring hanger. Now here you can see the restored half of the car which Tim's undertaken. Now here he's replaced the front chassis leg, the tie plate that you can see there with the 3 apertures in, and a complete front floor pan. There's the other chassis leg going into the outer sills, and really you have got a much stronger structurally looking car. There's the centre cross member. We then come on to the rear spring hanger. A very neat weld there. Some difference. Now onto the inside. Common rot place for the Miner, the inner sill, and this in a bit of a pickle. Now you can clearly see there other repair work that's been undertaken. And there's the finished example. Another Miner saved from the scrapyard in the sky. And the customer awaiting his restored body shell. For restoration of your Miner, there are now many panels available to bring your car up to scratch. Tim is now developing a side of his business, Panel Magic, to enhance all Miners.
I think really, looking back on it now, I think I was probably wrong to have done what I did on it, because I updated it to the new winkers and, you know...
and you've done a fairly comprehensive job on the disc braking system.
They decided to put disc brakes on, yes, because, you know, you're always sort of plagued with seizing cylinders and all sorts of things, you know.
A familiar story? Well, Owen Burton's technical genius has helped many Miner owners out of a tight spot. He's based at the Morris Miner Centre, Bath Limited.
What we've got here is basically a standard Morris Miner front suspension setup. We've tried to sympathetically modify. We've incorporated in here a coil spring unit, basically so you can lower the car down perhaps sort of 3 inches or so without losing the spring rate that you would normally happen with it. We've got a front anti-roll bar. The Miners again are not very good handlers in standard form. One of their basic problems is that they understeer a lot and you can land up in the hedge if you're not very careful going around a bend. So the roll bar itself brings the steering back more to neutral.
Yes.
Actually makes going around corners quite fun. And having lowered the car as well with this particular system, you can find you're riding a bit like an MG or a Triumph and actually outperforming some modern cars sometimes.
Now Owen, on the braking system of the Miner, we've got the niggle because of course the standard master cylinder is down under the front driver's floor pan, embedded in that chassis member. Now you've devised this pretty ingenious idea of having this polyurethane reservoir mounted up on top of the bulkhead. Talk us through this brainwave.
It really started off back in the early days when we were fitting Marina disc brakes. The piston displacement from the calipers, we found by experience, was emptying the master cylinders very quickly. So we can't change the master cylinder easily, so the best thing to do was to increase its reservoir capacity, which is basically what we've done with this unit. A standard Girling reservoir unit, especially with a piping, runs down alongside or through the chassis into a special plug in the back of the master cylinder and just keeps the master cylinder topped up.
And then of course, Owen, you've not got all the muck and general debris and carpet mess that tends to contaminate the reservoir.
Yeah, you take the top off the master cylinder and all the bits of carpet drop in, and then, you know,
it's quite convenient.
And then your brakes stop working anyway.
People who actually drive Morris thousands haven't really got thousands to splash around. Is that fair to say that?
Yes, it is. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a down market car, but you're quite right.
You need to be competitive.
Yes, you do, very much so. And also, people who drive Morris Miners are perhaps the private sector. They haven't got a company car. They haven't got the benefit of business expenses, so they're very aware of the cost of motoring.
So on the theme of cost, Nick, when the tax exempt was brought in by the government, what was that, 18 months, 2 years ago, did that assist your business at all? Did you find that things started to happen from then on?
I mean, obviously, yes, there was another sort of £140 odd that people could spend on their car. But I think also, particularly us chaps, we need to justify the expense on our cars. And, you know, it is nice to say, well, of course, you know, if we spend money on this car.
To the wife, you mean?
Absolutely. Yes, that's right. Yes, the sensible ones, yeah.
One very interesting aspect of Nick's business is this original Nuffield press, which produced all Morris Miner bumpers at Cowley from 1951. The machine is powered by electrics, hydraulics and pneumatics, and eventually presses the bumpers out looking like this. And then, through this series of fly presses, the starting handle apertures are produced along with the Miner bumper mounting holes. So nearly 50 years on, a little piece of Cowley is still very much linked to the Morris Minor. We've talked enough about the Minor now. Let's go for a test drive. Down here in deepest Somerset, I think you've got to say some of the roads are a touch on the narrow side. But really, it's a pleasure to drive. One thing you've got to say about this car, it certainly comes with a high percentage of good feel factor. Very, very light steering. The gearbox, to be honest with you, is an absolute dream. Now, of course, you've got to remember that considerable money has been spent on this machine to bring it up to standard. But to be honest with you, it's just like driving a brand new car. So when you discuss this motoring legend, the Morris 1000, quite often people say, well, my uncle had one of them, and I'm no exception. My uncle had one. Pete, now, when did your motoring liaison start with the Morris Minor?
Well, I think it must have been about 1964. I got rid of a Renault Dauphine because I thought it was an absolute load of rubbish, and I actually had a bank loan for about £200 and bought this UVB 21. The other one was a split windscreen one, and that's what people used to do in those days, scrap the cars. They'd had one bash in the wing, and the suspension leg was gone, and I bought it for £40, replaced that, and had some good service out of it.
And when really you look at the car today, some of the restoration work that some of the people we've talked about on the video, it's mass work, isn't it? And like you said, small faults years ago, they
scrapped them. Because everybody was then going into fantastic things like Ford, Zephyrs and Zodiacs and Crestas and all that sort of thing, wasn't it?
Another thing we quite often talked about, Pete, is when you make an epic journey on holiday, you normally talk about the car being loaded right up, suitcases, mothers and fathers and goodness knows what else in the car. What was the biggest load you ever carried in yours?
Well, I used to carry myself, Maureen, that's my wife, her mum and dad. Her mother was rather on the large side, and if her dad hadn't have been very small, neither of them would have got in the back seat together. But they
compensated for each other.
That's right. Yeah. One was large, one was small, and I don't think we ever took two children on holiday, but we certainly took the one. So consequently, we had the roof. We had a roof rack, push chair, luggage boot filled up, and everything. We used to have about 2 or 3 stops on the way to Bournemouth, mine, which is only 70 miles, and it would take us about 4 hours usually to get there, including the stops.
But you could sometimes get to about 50 miles an hour.
Oh, definitely, yes.
Yeah, right.
As you can see, I'm an old car owner because I've got an old Saab there. Right. Well, that one's been going for years, hasn't it?
Yeah.
It's been going for years and years. 13 years I've owned the Saab, and we have actually owned the Morris Minor for 22 years.
As the Minor faces life in the 21st century, a new obstacle presents itself. New European legislation is set to prohibit the use of leaded fuel.
Well, basically, as one changes over to only unleaded fuel, which gives a slightly higher combustion chamber temperature. The actual flash point of unleaded fuel is slightly higher than that of leaded fuel. One either has to make the materials in the cylinder head more resistant to heat, alternatively to substitute something in the fuel for the lead which one finds in leaded fuel.
What is the treatment going to involve then, James?
Simply putting metal pellets of a slightly soluble nature in your fuel tank so they dissolve at a very slow rate indeed, replacing the tetraethyl lead which would have been in leaded fuel.
And miner owners, have they attempted this so far to be running on unleaded, and how successful has it been, James?
I can't speak for other miner owners, but I've had 3 Morris miners over the past 7 years, in which I've perhaps done 50,000 miles using these pellets all the time, and I've had absolutely no problems at all.
What's this likely to cost the customer, James?
At the moment, there are several products on the market costing between £25 and £65, I understand.
And that seems good value, really, doesn't it? Because when you think what they're going to recoup in savings changing over to the unleaded, it sounds a good option.
It's certainly cheaper than modifying your cylinder head to resist the higher combustion temperatures.
Incidentally, what would that cost be if they decided for that option, James?
With us, £135, but it can easily cost as much as £200 in other parts of the country.
We're here, of course, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the miner, the actual day, 20th of September 1948, of when the first production miner rolled off the lines at Cowley. We're here with Ray Newell. Ray, has today been a success?
It's been a fantastic success, enhanced, of course, by the fine weather that we've had and the enthusiasts who've turned out to celebrate what is a very special day in the history of the Morris Minor.
Well, back in 1948, Morris Motors had 3 new models on offer to the British public. The Miner, the Oxford, and with us now, the MS, owned by Mick Burbridge. Mick, a magical example here of the Morris MS. Tell us a little bit about your car.
Right, it's been in the family since 1956. It done a really hard life up until 66 when it was laid up by my late father. It was absolutely a basket case. He passed away in 1980. I brought it out and it took me 5 years to renovate it.
Well, to complete the Morris range back in 1948, the Morris Oxford made up the 3rd model, and David Robinson is delightfully going to show us around his MO Morris Oxford. Now, David, you've taken particular care in this restoration. How long did it take you?
I bought the car in 1993 and started restoring it in August of that year, and it took me 5 years up to May of this year.
Now, what were the most difficult parts to become available, David, for this model?
Well, the body part was the main obstacle, because being such an early car, the body panels are non-existent, and every panel on this car had to be repaired.
Right, okay, so that was particularly difficult. Now, what about the mechanical aspects, David? A side valve engine on here, isn't it?
That's correct. The side valve, an early side valve, 49 to be precise.
Yes.
And but it was fortunate that it had got a reconditioned engine, so I didn't really have to do anything to the engine.
Before we conclude, we must return to Roy Davis, a man who enjoyed a long and notable career with the British Motor Corporation in its various guises, and one of the key contributors to this film. In the latter stages of his career, Roy was involved in the development of models such as the MG Montego. In 1984, he received a deputation from the Soviet Union at Cowley, including none other than Mikhail Gorbachev. A loyal company man to the last, even when faced with one of the world's most powerful men, Roy staunchly defended the Montego's fuel consumption statistics to the disbelieving Soviet leader.
50 years on, the car still is in use, still much admired, still respected by thousands of owners all around the world. It's a real tribute to Alec Isagonis and his team that they actually got it right. And we look forward now to the next 50 years when we hope to see the Morris Minor establish itself as a real classic car to be used in the future and provide endless pleasure for thousands of motorists right into the next millennium.
OK, Ray, thanks very much for assisting us in producing this video. Goodbye.